I'm taking YouTube viewers through my book, Authorized the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. We've hit Chapter 5, the value of the vernacular. And we've hit the all-important question, what does the Bible actually teach about Bible translation? I want to argue from Scripture that Scripture ought to be translated into vernacular Russian, vernacular Urdu, and vernacular English. There are two ways I'm going to do this. I'm going to argue from what Scripture says and how Scripture says what it says. Then I'm going to talk about English again, how we know what counts as vernacular. Then we'll be done. First, what Scripture says is that it's our commission as Jesus' disciples to teach the nations, to disciple them, helping them observe everything that Jesus has commanded. Unless you're going to say that he purposefully meant to exclude the Old Testament, then translation is very clearly demanded. For one thing, it's rather difficult to teach people everything Jesus has commanded if people can't ever read those things for themselves. For another, the fact that the Bible comes in 2 and kind of 3 languages is itself a demand for translation. How many people in the history of the world could read Biblical Hebrew, Koine Greek, and that smattering of Aramaic in the prophets? What Scripture also says is, and this to me has become so important, that edification requires intelligibility. I can't think of another passage of Scripture in which the principle at issue is stated so often and so explicitly. The immediate situation Paul faced was a bunch of Corinthian Christians who were speaking in tongues without a gifted translator present. And Paul could have just said, "Don't do that. Always have a translator." He didn't say that. He explained the value he was trying to preserve. He said, if you want to edify people, you have to use words they understand. Edification requires intelligibility. The one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation, Paul writes. He says, the one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. Now I want you all to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be built up. Now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you? Unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching. Over and over in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul gives the same principle. Yes, he applies the principle to wholly different languages, but that's why I've said elsewhere that Elizabethan English and contemporary English can be usefully regarded as different languages. This is one way in which they can. Perhaps its clearest expression is in verse 9. So with yourselves, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? For you will be speaking into the air. The King James Version actually uses words that are easier to understand than intelligible. It writes, except ye utter by the tongue words easy to be understood, how shall it be known what is spoken? I looked up this word easy, and one dictionary explained it as meaning readily recognizable, clear, distinct. That's what Ezra and the scribes did for the returning exiles in Nehemiah. Quote, they read from the book, from the law of God, clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. We simply don't know whether the scribes translated the Bible because the people no longer understood biblical Hebrew, or whether they explained it because the people no longer understood the Bible. Maybe both. What we do know is that both testaments praise the value of understanding. Read a lot of the Quran and it's just opaque. You can't tell who's talking and who they're talking to, what they're talking about. Read certain other mystical texts from various religions and ages, and you might be excused for thinking that the whole point is that you aren't supposed to understand. But read the Bible, even the more difficult parts, and you'll see that the writers wished to be understood. That leads us to point 2. Scripture itself, point 2, speaks in Greek and Hebrew vernacular when other options were available. We don't have much Hebrew outside the Old Testament to compare the Old Testament to. Matters are complicated by the fact that the Hebrew Bible was written over a period of 1,000 years. Surely the language changed over that time. In fact, we have evidence that it changed right in 1 Samuel. That comments on how prophets were formerly called seers. But we have a ton of Greek from outside the New Testament and from the same time period as the New Testament. We can compare the two, and this is what we found. The New Testament uses the language of the people. It did not use an elevated, grandiloquent, or archaic language. It used the vernacular. Koine, the very name of the Greek of the New Testament, means common. The King James translators themselves said, "As nothing is begun and perfected at the same time, and the latter thoughts are thought to be the wiser, so if we building upon their foundation that went before us, and being holpen by their labors, do endeavor to make that better, which they left so good, no man, we are sure, hath cause to mislike us. They, we persuade ourselves, if they were alive, would thank us." The King James translators were not KJV only. They would most definitely support the work of later translators building on their foundation and being helped by their labors. They themselves used multiple Bible translations as a basis for their work. In my book, I show that vernacular translation was a Reformation value that historically Christians of an evangelical stripe have held up very high. It's the Reformation that gave us translations into German, Spanish, French, and English. This value was also held by Christians in the early centuries of the church, and by believers in Yahweh before the time of Christ. Many Christians today don't realize that the New Testament itself, including both Paul and Jesus, quotes a Bible translation that we call the Septuagint. It was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and this Septuagint was made by Jews in the centuries before Christ was even born into this world. Now, we're not required to value what the Reformers valued or what ancient Jews valued, unless those values are taught in Scripture. And I think this value of vernacular translation, is taught in Scripture. Lovers of the King James Version may want to hear from another particular group of past Christians who valued translating the Bible into the vernacular, the KJV translators. The preface they wrote to their work, The Translators to the Reader, is full of wisdom, and in it they clearly stress the need for vernacular translation. They wrote, "We desire that the Scripture may speak like itself, as in the language of Canaan, that it may be understood even of the very vulgar." Now, how did the King James translators' work measure up to their own standards, their own goal of speaking in a way that the very vulgar, which just means the common man, that's a false friend, did they succeed in speaking to that man? I don't know. One of my ancestors was a common man in 17th century England, but I've never been one. I presume the King James translators knew better how to speak to that man than I do. But what I do know, friends on the internet, what I really know, one of the few things I really know, aside from how to throw a frisbee with accuracy and distance, is how to speak today's English to today's common man. And it is no slight against the King James translators to say that in this task, they are not as successful as 1 Corinthians 14 says they should ideally be. That is, the King James translators could not predict the future of English, even though they shaped that future indelibly. I'm a writer and an editor. All these books behind me are in my office because it's my job to write good English and to correct other people's English, and I need these books to help me. It's my job to make people's English sound more like the standards that are prevailing among polite, educated people today. If there are any polite people left, which I doubt every time I go on Facebook. If an author turned into my publisher something like the King James Version today, I'd have to mark him up over and over again with red pen. Do you see that? I'm not blaming the King James translators for this problem. I feel quite certain that my English will be less than fully intelligible to the average English speaker 400 or 500 years from now. Maybe they'll get a lot of it, but we have no indication that English is going to stop changing anytime soon. It has changed within my lifetime and yours. Just watch an old TV show. They just don't talk quite the same way we do. Over time, those changes build up to misunderstandings, to static that impedes communication, as I've tried to show. I am very bad at very many things. I'm bad at fixing cars. My 2004 Yukon has got some kind of problem right now that I just cannot seem to do anything about. I am bad at finding time to make fixes in our home, but I magnify mine office. I am good at English. Ever since I was a tiny kid with an English major for a dad, I have loved English and paid it a great deal of attention. I love good English oh so much. I listen obsessively to the highly nerdy History of English podcast and the Lexicon Valley podcast. I know etymologies, I know vocabulary, I know dialects. I just know in my gut, like way down in there near my duodenum, how English is supposed to go. And I know that King James Version English is not my English. It's a different English, like Kenyan English and Indian English and Singaporean English are different Englishes. As I've said repeatedly, there's still a lot of overlap between Elizabeth's English and mine, but things that are different are not the same. And here's the great thing. You don't have to take my word for all this. There are two great tools, both of which are about as objective as linguistic tools come, that you can use to see if what I'm saying is true. I'm not sure why none of the few critical reviewers of my book have made any use of these tools, but there it is. First, you can look in the awesome OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. I have digital access through my local public library, and I use it all the time. It's the only English dictionary in existence that traces the complete history, as much as we can reconstruct it, of our mother tongue. And repeatedly, when I look up King James words that sound a little funny to me, I see 3 little letters next to the sense I think the King James translators meant. OBS, period. Obsolete. Do this. Do it. Look up halt from 1 Kings 18:21 in the Oxford English Dictionary. See which sense fits the context and the Hebrew if you can. See how the OED editors describe the history of this word. Look up remove and see which sense fits Proverbs 22:28. Look up one of my nerdy favorites, commendeth, and see which sense fits Romans 5:8. Second tool. I often turn, as all linguists must, to a linguistic corpus. A corpus is a body of written work from a language. An English corpus is a collection of like 1 billion or more English words from articles or books or short stories or what have you, from America or Australia or Alberta or what have you. And there are historical corpuses too, like the corpus of historical American English. Look up the word host in each one, for example, and you'll find that while the word used to mean army, it now almost never means that particular sense unless people are making a historical reference. The army sense of host has pretty well died, and you can see it for yourself. That sense has morphed like a cloud in the sky into a metaphorical extension of the army sense. When you have a host of problems, you are using that sense. The metaphor is dead now, but we still have the word. It has lost its older sense. It has other senses too that it didn't used to, like radio talk show host. All of this is relevant when you come to a phrase in the Bible like the Lord of hosts. It means the Lord of armies, and some modern translations translate it that way. It matters that we understand the metaphor here and that we don't let it get obscured by changes in English. This work is nerdy and fun and nerdy and kind of hard and nerdy, but a little practice will get you a long way. And here's where I think it will take you. Here's where many years of this kind of work have taken me. I've had to conclude that more often than I realized before I started reading contemporary English Bible translations, I didn't really understand the King James Version as well as I arrogantly thought that I did. C.S. Lewis said, "The truth is that if we are to have translation at all, we must have periodical retranslation. There is no such thing as translating a book into another language once and for all, for a language is a changing thing. If your son is to have clothes, it is no good buying him a suit once and for all. He will grow out of it and have to be reclothed." You may by now sense where this cumulative case of mine is going. If lots of Christians think the King James Version is too hard to read, and if contemporary King James readers can't be expected to understand Elizabethan English because of false friends and dead words and other difficulties, and if computers can't come to the rescue, and if Bible translations, biblically speaking, ought to be made into the vernacular, it is indeed right to ask whether the King James Version ought to be allowed to decline in use. Despite the valuable things that we will lose if 55% of Bible readers who are now reading the King James Version becomes 5%. Because the one thing that outweighs all the values of retaining the King James Version as a common standard is whether people today can be expected to understand its English. We should ask, along with biblical scholar Glenn Scorgie, if a translation is published but fails to communicate, is it really a translation? Now, in countless places, the King James Version does not fail to communicate God's words to modern readers. I am eager to acknowledge this fact because I grew up on the King James and it was God's tool to bring me new life. But in countless places, it does fail. Through no fault of the King James translators or of us. It's somewhere between Beowulf and the English of today. I therefore do not think the King James Version is sufficiently readable to be relied upon as a person's only or main translation, or as a church's or Christian school's only or main translation. Thankfully, we don't have to give up everything we valued in the King James Version in order to gain the readability benefits of newer translations. The best way to honor the translation and revision work of the King James translators is to allow it to continue. I'll explain what I mean in the final video in this little series going through my book, but first I'll try to answer some objections to my argument. I think there are some very good objections that must be discussed and a couple bad ones that must be dismissed. Coming up next.